Hey guys, today I'm finally getting into the Everest Gen 7. I was sent this car and told that we had a bunch of upgrades that would bolt onto this, so we're gonna see if that is actually the case or not. I've actually got two of these here. They're both the Pro version. So the car comes with a radio and a trickle charger for the included nickel metal hydride 6-cell battery pack. As far as ready to run radios and stuff goes, they're all basically the same, it seems like, anymore. None of them are truly impressive, but they usually all get the job done. So here we have the Gen 7. The first thing to note is that this car is heavy. It's over 7 pounds. I think it's 7.7 pounds out of the box, which is heavy for a factory ready to run car. A lot of that is to be attributed to this body. Now, a big part of why this thing is so heavy is all of the things that they've added to it. This roof rack assembly with a 5th tire and bead lock, the fender flares, running boards, and then rear fender flares. Those are all a hard molded plastic design. Lastly, on the inside, there's actually an internal cage structure on this body. And you can't see any of that because the windows are blacked out like a Traxxas, but you still have all of that structure inside, which does add some rigidity to this body. It doesn't flop around like a typical Lexan body. It hinges at the back and there's Velcro in the front. So when you've got the truck itself, you just pull up on the front and then you hinge it backwards. Now, you are just relying on Velcro to hold that body down while you're on the trail. There is no option for a body post on it just to make sure that it's retained, and I have seen these pop up while in use. Underneath of the body, we do have molded inner fender flares of a hard plastic, a nice detail as far as that goes. It does, like I said, include a 6-cell 3000 milliamp nickel metal pack. So if you need something to get you going, everything you do need is actually included in the kit, but it is a nickel metal pack. So we've got full width front and rear bumpers, aluminum links all the way around, and a BPC chassis. So BPC is a company that's actually local to me here, and I do believe that they worked with Redcat to give them the design rights to this chassis. We were sent these cars and we were told that SCX10 upgrades would bolt onto this car, and I want to see which of those parts that is actually the case for. A lot of the designs on this car do look very familiar, so we could see some parts that do cross over. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dig right in, tear the axle and transmission out of this car, and give you guys a close-up look at those parts, and we'll see which of those parts we can upgrade. The tires on this car don't feel bad. They feel soft enough. They don't have a ton of stick to them, and also I've seen that the foams in these break down almost immediately. The initial look of the beadlocks themselves don't seem bad. Don't know how the hold is though. If you give it a little pull, it actually looks like they come off fairly easy. So it depends on how much power you put through those, but I was able to remove those without too much effort. The tire foam that's inside is a memory foam design, it appears. If you give it some squish, it stays there and comes back pretty slowly. So you are going to need to change out those foams for decent performance. It is worth noting that the axle does come with all aluminum steering linkages as well. The truss design on this axle is actually kind of nice. It slides over the posts that you're used to seeing on the axle housing, slides down, and then is retained by 2 screws on this side, and then the servo plate that bolts on top retains and holds all of it down. And that is what gives you that upper 4-link mount on the back side of that axle. Now, underneath of those beadlocks, we will see that these axles do include an aluminum hex. There is no set screw on this, so they're not retained and they fall off pretty easily. So as I mentioned, this is the Pro version of the Redcat Gen 7, and you can see that it does include CVD style axles. The knuckle and C-hub design on this axle looks very familiar and very similar to an Axial SCX10. So when I was sent this car, again, I was told that the SCX10 upgrades that were available would bolt onto this. This is the Vanquish 8-degree inner C. Now, trying to slide that onto this axle, you can get it over the initial OD. However, the bosses that they have that stick up for the attachment of the C-hub to the axle stick up much higher than what is designed for a standard SCX10 style C-hub. So you are not going to be able to install directly these C-hubs onto this axle. Now you may think that that's just a simple amount of filing, and I've actually done that on this side. So if I grab the proper C-hub for that side and I attempt to install it, I can now get it over that. However, now the hole location to attach the C-hub to the axle housing does not line up. The C-hub position on this one is further out, and what this axle is designed for is much closer to this shoulder. So you're not going to be able to bolt on a normal C-hub to these axles. Now, since I can't test if these C-hubs will actually work, I can't in turn test to see if the 8-degree knuckles that pair with these 8-degree C-hubs would work. Now, you may be able to bolt on a stock style set of axial knuckles onto this axle with the stock C-hubs. I don't know that. I don't actually have a set of that to test here right now. So with the factory knuckle and axle shaft removed, I'm going to attempt to install one of the Vanquish VVD axle shafts into the housing. Now, the Vanquish VVD will not install into this housing. It appears that the locker design will not allow this to work. Comparing the factory Redcat shafts to the Vanquish shafts, you can actually probably see why we're having issues here. With the axles side by side, you can see that the notch that's cut on this factory axle extends much further up the shaft than what we're used to seeing. It's probably almost double. It looks like it's over a 1/4 inch further along the shaft than this version. Here's another little bit of bad news. The 4 screws that retain the locker to the ring gear are 2mm, however, they're Phillips head. So you're going to need a Phillips head driver to remove that locker and ring gear from each other. So here's the ring gear and locker assembly that's used in these axles. They do have a metal one-piece locker on there that by design doesn't look too bad. However, it is fairly lightweight, which makes me wonder what the material is that's actually used here and how it will hold up. The gear set that's included in these axles actually feels pretty good. The bolt pattern that's used on here is basically the same as what we're used to seeing on the Axial and older HPI gear sets that we're used to seeing. However, it does not accept a bolt-in style locker like our Incision locker. While the bolt pattern is the same, the recess that fits inside of these gears is not the same as what the other ones are. So you're not able to just bolt on an upgraded locker to these axles. This locker feels pretty good, and the axle shafts that are included with this version, which are the Pro version, so it's the CVD style, actually has a pretty nice fit without much slop. Just a little bit of slop, kind of standard for what you would expect. But overall, this doesn't feel bad. However, if you were trying to upgrade to something like a Vanquish VVD, you're actually not going to have any success there because this is much too loose. It's a much different size than what you're seeing in an axial upgrade like this. The pinion gear of this axle is a standard 2-piece style design with a pinion shaft and the pinion gears sliding on and then being retained by an E-clip. So this is a 4313 axial gear set, and I bolted on an Incision locker. Now, the bearing spacing of this actually does work with this housing. You can actually just drop it right in, and it feels like initially it may work. However, the gear mesh feels much too tight with that 13-tooth pinion that we replaced in there. So it doesn't feel like this is probably going to be a proper fit. So inside this case right now is that 4313 machined gear set made for an axial, and even with the case just pressed together, not even tightened down, the gear mesh is off. I can't even spin the pinion gear by hand, and it's just not right. So this setup is not going to work if you're trying to replace that ring and pinion gear with a new locker as well. I think it's also worth noting that the bearings that they used inside these axles and at the pinion here is a 5x10 rather than a 5x11. A 5x11 is more of the standard size pinion bearing that we've seen there and is a much better bearing in general for load handling. The drive shafts that are included on this car are a universal joint style design with a metal yoke and a plastic slider portion. The motor in this car is just listed as 550. It actually doesn't show the turn or anything about the motor other than that on the can at least. This transmission uses a locked out spur gear, so there is no slipper device on this at all. That means that all the power that's transmitted from the motor will be going to the spur gear, and if you hit a bind, you're either going to stall the motor or strip out that spur gear. I don't mind a locked transmission, but it is something to know, especially when running 48-pitch gears. Now, this locked out slipper clutch does just actually have a plastic engagement piece that slides onto that top shaft, and that's all that engages it. So there is the chance also then that you can strip out this hub. One nice touch to note is that the top shaft of this transmission is triple bearing supported. There's an extra bearing out here at the outside by the motor plate that a typical 3-gear transmission like this doesn't normally have. So we've got one bearing out here, and then the traditional 2 bearings that are inside that help support that inner gear. So inside of the Gen 7 transmission, we've got a very similar gear set to something we're used to seeing. However, there is some major differences right off the bat that then make for other compatibility issues. At first sight, this top shaft looks very familiar with a gear that slides over a pin. However, that pin size is different. This is a 2mm pin rather than a standard 1.5mm pin. That makes gear sets that are already available not compatible because they will not fit over that 2mm pin. The top shaft is significantly shorter than this Vanquish upgraded top shaft for an SCX10, but that's because this one was built for a dual slipper setup, and this one uses that locked out top gear like we already saw. We could use this complete top shaft and gear setup to swap into this if you did have a problem with that top output gear. You do have to remember that in most of these 3-gear transmissions that we've seen in the past, this top gear is normally a sintered metal, even in factory condition. So if you did need to upgrade that top gear, you could use this entire assembly with a new top gear and top shaft, but you would also have to purchase some sort of slipper setup while you were at it. So this would then become a much more expensive upgrade than just replacing or upgrading one part at a time. The idler gear in this transmission is one of the very few parts that we've seen so far to be a direct swap. So if you need an idler gear, you can use just about any of the 20-tooth idler gears that you've seen available so far. The final gear in this transmission is a much different design than we're normally used to seeing. At first appearance, it may look similar. However, the gear actually slides over the output and is driven by this large pin that slides in. If you were to blow up this output gear, there wouldn't, of course, just be a normal output that you could use. If you had a complete lower gear and output set, you're actually still not going to be able to run that. The reason is that this output design that they're using, this diameter on this piece is a 10mm diameter, and that is what the bearings in this case ride on. So the bearing that they use in this case is actually a 10-15-4. Now, the reason that that's important is because what we're used to seeing is this, and this is an 8-16-5. Now, that is a much beefier bearing in general. And the other reason that that's important is because then you cannot use a normal upgrade set like this one from Incision. This is the Incision SCX10 style replacement lower gear, and this would be like one of the outputs that you would normally see bolt to this. However, with this gear and output set normally used to this 8mm ID with a 16mm OD, you're not going to be able to bolt that in. This output will not work with this 10mm ID bearing. Obviously it doesn't fit. And then you can't just put this on because it's got a 16mm OD where this one only has a 15mm. Let alone the difference in width from 5mm on this one to 4mm here. So in general, we're out of luck in this department. If you're thinking about swapping out the transmission completely, that could be an option, but one thing to note specifically is the bolt pattern on the bottom of this transmission case. This Vanquish case, which is made for a standard SCX10 style build, you can see that the outside bolts are wider than the inside. This one, that is not the case. It's got 4 equally separated bolts there. So you're not going to be able to swap this in right away, at least not without drilling at least 2 holes. After all that, is this car worth it? I don't know. I was sent it and told one thing, and that didn't seem to be the case. I found maybe one part that was a direct swap, and that really wasn't that helpful at that. So with all of that, would I buy this car? I don't think that this is the car for me. I don't think that this is the type of project that I'm usually looking for. I would be concerned about being able to find upgrade parts for weak links if I found something happening over and over again, because those durability and upgrade parts are going to have to be made specific to this car. So then this car has to jump all the hurdles that all the other cars in the market that came out do as well. And are the aftermarket companies going to jump on this car versus cars like an HPI or a Traxxas or the plethora of parts that are already available for an Axial? I don't think that they probably will. So if you buy this car, you could be stuck buying just the replacement parts that they already have available for it, or the small amount of upgrade parts that may be developed either by Redcat themselves or by a couple of small vendors or things like that. Who's to say? But right now, I see that this thing has got some significant hurdles to have to jump over in order for this to be the wide success that it possibly had the ability to do. So guys, those are my findings on the Redcat. Not exactly the outcome that I thought I was going to have at the beginning of the day from what I was told previously, but I'm glad that I went through the process and found out the things that I did as I went. So hopefully this helps out some of you guys if you're interested in buying this, or you already have it and you were thinking about certain upgrades. Hopefully you can save some money and not buy the wrong parts with bad information. Let me know if you were thinking about buying the Redcat, or if you already bought it, and what your thoughts on the car was before you really got into it, because the perception of this was a little bit different than what I've normally seen from a Redcat. So I'll be interested to hear what you thought before you bought it, and then possibly if you already bought it, what you think now that you do have it. So even though I didn't go over all of the features of this car, I did have some very specific things that I wanted to find out, and I did accomplish those. So hopefully this video helped some of you. I appreciate you guys watching. Thanks for all the comments, and we'll see you on the next one.